Welcome, everyone. My name is Adriana Bernal. I'm the Strategic Partnerships Manager at Casita Coalition, and I'm excited to kick off our webinar, Clearing the Path, Removing Second-Generation Barriers to Middle Housing, our first webinar of the year. We want to thank Arnold Ventures for their sponsorship of our webinar series. Casita Coalition is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to building stronger, more resilient communities by championing diverse, attainable housing options through ADUs, townhomes, cottage courts, and other middle-scale home types. We bring together a powerful network of homeowners, practitioners, and policymakers across the country to understand challenges, remove barriers, and implement solutions that unlock the full potential of middle housing. Through narrative change, systems reform, technical assistance, capacity building, and policy implementation, we're pushing the middle housing movement forward. Now, a little housekeeping. You'll find bios for all of today's incredible presenters posted as a link in the chat. And to keep things running smoothly, please drop your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, not the chat, and we'll address them during the audience Q&A session at the end. Today's webinar focuses on the next frontier of the middle housing movement, code reform and infrastructure management. Many people think that passing zoning bills will solve our housing crisis alone, but we know at Casita Coalition that the road from legislation to units built is much more complicated than that. Our founder, Janice Pinkston, likes to say that standing in between legislation and units built are first-generation and second-generation barriers. She equates it to a double brick wall. Zoning barriers are the first wall, and it's not until we get rid of those initial barriers that we even know what those second-generation barriers are, such as code reform and infrastructure management. Today's webinar is for those of us who like to wonk out on the details, because we know details matter. If secondary barriers aren't removed, you can have a situation where middle housing is technically allowed, but functionally infeasible due to costly requirements designed for large developments. During the session today, our speakers will share their important research exploring codes and other standards currently impacting the production of middle housing, while also debunking some damaging myths about the infrastructure impacts of middle housing. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our three presenters, John Zeanah, FAICP, Principal and Owner of Interval LLC, Paul Runge, Project Director at Cascadia Partners, and Tara Sorrels, Associate Planner at Cascadia Partners. John will present findings from his report, Beyond Zoning, Hidden Code Barriers to Middle-Scale Housing for the Center for Building in North America. Paul and Tara will present findings from Cascadia Partners' research brief, Flush the Fear, Middle Housing Can Fit Within Your Sewer's Capacity, done in partnership with Welcoming Neighbors Network and Arnold Ventures. Both of their publications will be posted in the chat during the Q&A and shared along with the webinar recording. Following the presentations, I will moderate a discussion and Q&A session with our speakers where we'll answer audience questions. So we're excited to learn from their expertise and to shed light on code reform and infrastructure capacity. With that, let's get started. I'm going to hand it off to John, who will kick us off.
Thank you, Adriana. All right, as Adriana said, I'm John Zeanah. I'm going to talk today about a report that I worked on for the Center for Building in North America that was released last September called Beyond Zoning, Hidden Code Barriers to Middle-Scale Housing. The genesis of this report was having worked with not only through the city of Memphis, but working with a developer who was building a middle-scale housing development in the uptown neighborhood of Memphis. That's shown here on the screen. What the developer, Andre Jones, was working towards was a project that included a cottage court of 11 units, two fourplex live-work buildings, and then four fourplexes. What Andre sort of uncovered along the way as he was working through that project was not only very illuminating, I think, for him, but certainly for us as we were trying to help get more missing middle housing done as a goal of our comprehensive plan with the city. and ultimately more done in Memphis and in the state of Tennessee. So, next slide. So I wear a couple of professional hats. I'm in the role of Chief of Development and Infrastructure for the city of Memphis. I also own a consulting practice called Interval, and then, of course, write for Center for Building and others. And so, as Adriana said, you can find the report on the Center for Building website, but it'll also be shared as a part of this webinar. Next slide. So when Andre was going through the process of doing his project Malone Park Commons, one of the things that he figured out pretty quickly was that getting the zoning fixed to allow his project was probably the least of his issues. Andre was able to get a zoning variance that solved for a couple of issues on his site in order to get it permitted. He didn't really encounter too many issues with that. It was a discretionary review, but ultimately it went fairly quickly. It didn't cost a whole lot to get through. It was when Andre started the process of moving for construction that he ran into a lot of different issues. And so we're going to talk about some of those issues that he experienced and the other builders like him experience, not just here in Tennessee, but across the country as they're trying to navigate getting middle scale housing built. So where I like to start is the threshold between the residential code and the building code. The International Code Council standards are used throughout the country. States adopt their state building codes, but by and large, they follow along the standards that are promulgated through the International Code Council. So the International Residential Code, which is covers single family buildings and generally less expensive, and then the International Building Code that is essentially the multifamily and commercial code. Let's go to the next slide. One more. Yeah, great. And so a lot of the permitting and regulatory requirements in the residential code are much more simple. Whereas in the commercial building code, it typically requires a commercially licensed contractor. A lot of particularly small multifamily buildings are not that different from, say a larger single family building. So the alignment of the type of builder that would more naturally build a smaller multifamily is much closer to the residential code. Next slide. The residential code includes a lot of prescriptive structural tables. In other words, a lot of the engineering for residential code projects has been done for the code. And so, the builder simply just has to follow a lot of prescriptive standards that are in the code. Builder prepared plans are often sufficient. In other words, there's not a detailed plan set that includes things like mechanical, electrical, plumbing, the types of things that are required in the building code. So designs that go through the building code typically require a professional stamp from an architect or an engineer, not just for mechanical, electrical, plumbing, but for structural and for things like sprinkler engineering. Next slide. In most jurisdictions, residential permitting is much simpler, but commercial permitting is much more difficult. A lot of communities have, different pathways for getting through the building code review process for a residential permit versus a commercial permit. The IBC covers everything from, like we said, the small multifamily, 3-unit, 4-unit, 6-unit, et cetera, all the way up to industrial warehouses, airports, sports facilities. So it's natural that there's going to be a higher level of scrutiny for larger commercial projects. The issue is our smaller multifamily projects are getting lumped in with those. Next. Some of the biggest cost drivers around the building code have to do with the fire safety elements. Residential codes of 48 states out of 50 in the United States have exempted buildings that are built out of the residential code from sprinkler standards. So typically, smoke alarms and fire rated separations are really all that's required out of the residential code. Whereas once you get into the building code, sprinkler systems are typically required that can be very costly. The NFPA 13R standard is what is used for in most locations for multifamily, even though it is a less intense version of the NFPA 13 standard, which you see on the right. It still can be a very costly system. Next slide. There is also the NFPA 13D system. As I mentioned, 48 out of the 50 states in the U.S. Do exempt buildings in the residential code from sprinkler standards. The NFPA 13D standard is designed for buildings in the residential code, so we don't see it as often, but it is a lower cost standard than the NFPA 13R, and is a standard that some states are experimenting, and cities as well, experimenting with using on structures that have more units than two, particularly for small multifamily. Next slide. There are other local code hurdles as well. As I mentioned, that gap between 2 units and 3 units that's in the building code often gets transferred over to other code requirements in local jurisdictions. Just, to create a dividing line between, residential and multifamily, residential and commercial, residential and non-residential, however it might be divided in your jurisdiction. Everything from trash requirements, tax requirements, parking requirements. There's a lot of differences that get placed in that gap between 2 units and 3 units. Next slide. Some common ones are in stormwater, which are often triggered by unit count, not necessarily building size. The issue with stormwater is really about the area of impervious surface. Doesn't really have much bearing on unit counts as much as building footprint. So a single family house with the same building footprint as a quadplex may have much higher requirements in terms of meeting stormwater compliance in one jurisdiction or the other. Next slide. Utilities follow very similar divides, where traditional single-family utility connections could be used for small multifamily, but often small multifamily get lumped in with larger commercial requirements, and that's not only for the infrastructure itself, but on the fees as well. Next slide. Energy code differences are found between the residential code and the building code. Certainly, energy code requirements help to ensure that, as new buildings are coming online, they're more sustainable, they're more resilient. But again, they're written with a divide between between 2 units and 3 units, and so the higher requirements typically attach to small multifamily once you get to 3 units. Next slide. Accessibility requirements attach once you get to 4 units. Next slide. Elevator requirements typically attach once you go beyond 3 stories. Next slide. Stair requirements also get added on once you get beyond 3 stories. Next slide. And then, of course, if you're trying to do renovation of existing buildings, maybe if your town has a lot of, older single-family buildings that, are sized in such a way that they could be converted into quadplex, for example. Those codes, that change of occupancy triggers a lot of these additional requirements. So if your community is looking at changing building codes, don't forget about existing buildings and what needs to be adjusted to make sure that conversions are treated the same as new in your community. Next slide. Last couple of things. Mixed use is another example of code burden to think about. For a lot of communities that want to see, small mixed use, the ideal is to have, ground floor commercial with residential above. But a lot of times those projects get kicked up into a much more stringent level of requirements. So on the earlier slide, when I showed the difference between the 13R and the 13 sprinkler system, and you could visually see the physical differences between those two systems and what all is required. A lot of vertical mixed use is going to kick into those commercial sprinklers, even if the commercial on the ground floor is not something that would require, say, a vent hood or have combustible materials, that sort of thing. And so for communities trying to do small scale mixed use, a lot of times horizontal mixed use is going to be a lot more cost efficient. And so if you're trying to encourage more vertical mixed use in your codes, think about what ground floor commercial triggers in terms of building code requirements and maybe an otherwise residential building and what changes could be made to make those requirements a little less stringent for vertical mixed use, particularly for small buildings. Next slide. The bottom line here is through so many of these regulations, what we're doing is streamlining multifamily permitting and construction. While next slide, we're extracting the most concessions out of our commercial development. And what it often does in many jurisdictions is, communities try to make middle scale housing legal by changing zoning, but then there are all these other regulations where we're extracting maximum concessions from IBC development that make missing middle infeasible to build. And so really, the main point of the report that was written is for communities that are wanting to see more middle scale housing built, you've got to go beyond zoning. Zoning is certainly a critical first step, but there's so many other steps that communities need to look at in their regulatory environment. And I think that's my last slide. Yeah. All right, thank you. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Paul and Tara to talk about their report.
Great. Thanks, John. Well, the slides get pulled up. I'll introduce myself. My name is Paul Runge. I'm a consultant with Cascadia Partners, which is an urban planning firm based in sunny Portland, Oregon. And as a reminder, my colleague Tara and I are going to be addressing a question related to, though perhaps a little upstream of John's topic of appropriate building code standards for middle housing. And that question is, now it's sort of up on the screen, can middle housing be accommodated by the existing sewer system in your city? And to this we say, flush the fear, and we will tell you why. But first, let's take a look at an example of how the question of sewer capacity is causing problems and leading some people to assume that their sewer can't handle middle housing. Next slide. These are some headlines from an online news outlet in Arlington, Virginia. In 2023, Arlington's County Board approved a zoning update to allow middle housing in new areas, and an opposition group sued them, citing concerns about sewer backups and alleging that the county had failed to conduct adequate sewer impact studies. In the trial, one of the county's chief engineers testified, quote, "It was very clear that we had capacity system-wide to accommodate gradual marginal increases along individual single-family streets. But the zoning change is still on hold, and the lawsuit is still outstanding on procedural grounds." So I think what this demonstrates is that sewer capacity can be used to threaten middle housing reform. And it invites the question, who was right about whether Arlington's existing sewers have the capacity for middle housing? And what about other cities? do their systems have capacity as well? Next slide. So we sought to answer that question by conducting a study in partnership with the Welcoming Neighbors Network, which is a national pro-housing advocacy coalition, and Arnold Ventures, which is a philanthropic foundation that advocates for evidence-based policy solutions. The study culminated in a report called Flush the Fear, which you can find online, and it sounds like it's going to be shared later in this webinar. The study approach was pretty simple. We went out and we reviewed documents. We interviewed city planners and engineers from 4 cities seeking to understand how they had planned for sewer capacity when allowing middle housing, and then how their systems were handling middle housing now that it was being built. So I'll briefly walk through a case study for Portland, Oregon, before passing it to my colleague Tara to describe our key findings. Next slide. In the 2010s, there was a significant advocacy push in Portland for middle housing. By 2020, the city was preparing to allow the housing types that you can see on the screen here. And they went ahead and conducted a study of whether local sewer capacity could accommodate middle housing in existing neighborhoods. Essentially, the city projected where middle housing was likely to be built and whether the sewer system could handle that change. Now, Portland has 2 types of sewers. It has a legacy combined system where stormwater and sanitary sewage flow in the same pipe. And then it has a newer separated system where stormwater and sanitary sewage flow in separate pipes. Portland's study found that that middle housing's effect on sanitary sewer flows would not be a problem in either the combined system or the separated system. So we heard a similar thing across our case studies and from non-city affiliated engineers too. You don't want backups. People flush all sorts of things down the toilet. And so sanitary sewer pipes are typically sized with some extra room. And water usage has actually declined in many places due to more efficient appliances and fixtures. That was the case in Portland. So that helps with capacity as well. Stormwater is really where you have more of a concern. And I think John sort of alluded to this being an area of the building code where there's more requirements. Portland's study did find that the stormwater side of the separated sewer system did have potential capacity deficiencies affecting about 1 in 20 lots. But those concerns were alleviated by limiting how much lot area a building could cover, by restricting development in landslide-prone areas that present problems for how well water can infiltrate. And the issues were also alleviated by requiring developers to extend or upsize infrastructure if they wanted to develop parcels that were considered inadequately served. So Portland's study ultimately concluded that middle housing would have a net neutral effect on the separated stormwater system because of all of those interventions. The study gave middle housing the green light to move forward. So as a high level takeaway, the city started from a place of, yes, this can work. And then they sought reassurance in detail through a study. And then they put in place policy solutions to ensure that the change went smoothly. Next slide. So since middle housing was re-legalized, Portland has permitted over 1,400 new infill and middle housing infill middle housing and accessory dwelling units. And as expected by the study, the city has not experienced any localized overflows and backups. So a success. Developers do have to manage stormwater on site as much as feasible. They have to upgrade deficient infrastructure that may be around or serving the site. But what that generally means is that developers seek sites that can percolate stormwater and that are in areas that are well served by infrastructure. So in other words, developers, they try to avoid costly problem areas. Next slide. The city is now considering allowing mid-rise apartments in a large part of Portland's inner east side. And they are now following a similar path as they did for middle housing. They're starting with a study. So the city's Planning and Infrastructure Bureau has completed a study of infrastructure capacity in 2025. And the City Council's Land Use Committee recently unanimously approved a resolution to consider zoning changes by mid-2027. Next slide. So we think this is an illustrative case of how all this can work. and of our broader point that cities don't need to blindly block middle housing over sewer concerns. You just need a game plan. So existing infrastructure can often handle the job and gives you a place to start. And we encourage folks to start from a default position of, yes, this can work. Let's figure out exactly how. And to John's point, it's very smart to identify what the most cost-efficient solutions out there are, so that you're not overburdening development with requirements that aren't necessary. Okay, that's it for me. I'm going to pass it to my colleague Tara to finish this up and take us through our high-level takeaways, starting with the next slide.
Yes, thanks, Paul. So if our case studies show us that a breakdown in sewer infrastructure isn't happening, which they did, then we have to ask why. And so I'm going to share some of our answers to the why. And so the first reason is dispersal. When we build a large new subdivision on the edge of town, we then have to lay miles of new pipe, and the downstream trunk lines may or may not be able to handle that concentrated increase in flow. Middle housing is different, right? It's a distributive growth model. It adds units into the existing fabric across the city so that the impact is spread across the whole network rather than hitting one single pipe all at once. Next slide. The second reason is timing. Middle housing is incremental. It doesn't happen overnight. If we have a built-out neighborhood city block that is rezoned for fourplexes, we're not going to see 10 fourplexes pop up the next morning. You may see one this year, another in 3 years, two more in a decade. And so this gives the city's public works department time to monitor flows and time to align utility and maintenance cycles with the actual rate of growth and where that growth is going. And then on the next slide, we have reason number 3, which is a technical one, just basic pipe capacity. Neighborhood sanitary sewer mains are typically sized with extra room, as Paul was stating, to avoid regular backups. And in our case studies, the engineers that we interviewed also felt confident that the existing mains under residential streets would typically have enough room to accommodate the additional flow of a few ADUs or extra cottage clusters without any additional issues. Next slide, please. Fourth, we have policy solutions. We don't just have to hope that pipes work. We can use policy to make them work. As Paul mentioned, stormwater is often the bigger hurdle, but cities can enact rules to manage that. And so we can limit new flows by regulating lot coverage and not requiring off-street parking. We can also reduce the burden on the public system by installing green infrastructure within the right-of-way and fixing old pipes to prevent inflow and infiltration of groundwater into that system. And then we can also require developers to manage some or all new stormwater on site using strategies like rain gardens, permeable pavers, or dry wells. And in this way, we can grow our housing stock while simultaneously modernizing our drainage strategy. And so every city is going to have its own specific needs and context, but there are many tools available to choose from to meet those specific localized needs while also still encouraging that development to happen. Next slide, please. So now there's an added bonus, the financial sustainability of infill. So infill middle housing adds new ratepayers and new revenue, often without adding a single new foot of public pipe that the city would eventually have to pay to repair or replace. And so infill housing is a way to maximize the return on investment of the infrastructure that we've already paid for. Next slide, please. So how do we implement this? And I think John hit on this as well. It starts with collaboration. We need to break down the silos between the housing planners and the sewer engineers. We should bring engineers into the room early. They can help identify where the system is strongest and help draft codes that make it easy for small-scale developers to connect to the system without adding unnecessary red tape or expense. And then on the planner side, planners need to make a strong case to engineers for why middle housing is a necessary solution And be sure to consider the impacts of various development standards on sewer flows specifically. Next slide, please. We also need holistic planning. So cities should be transparent about their bottlenecks. If there is a specific neighborhood in the jurisdiction where the pipes truly are at their limit, show that on a map, right? We don't want to block middle housing everywhere because of a problem in one spot. And we certainly don't want to surprise builders of middle housing with a bottleneck that they couldn't have known about. We also recommend providing pre-approved building plans. We saw this in South Bend. And these don't just save developers money, but they can allow the city to pre-vet design and massing choices that can also minimize sewer impact from the start. And then we'll go to the last slide. Finally, we need to modernize our technical solutions or our technical standards specifically. So one of our findings was that simple tweaks can save projects. And this gets at what John spoke about regarding local code hurdles and utility connections. But for example, allowing multiple middle housing units to share a single 6-inch lateral pipe rather than requiring a brand new cut in the street pipe for every front door of the same development. That can be the difference between a project being feasible and a project failing. And so testing our requirements for financial and physical feasibility helps to ensure that developers are actually incentivized to start building the housing that our communities need. And so at the end of the day, we want middle housing to be built. And our report shows that incremental growth can typically work within existing infrastructure. And there are policy tools available to adapt to any local conditions that make that more challenging. But fear about the sewer system just is not a necessary ingredient. With that, I'll pass it back to Adriana, our moderator, for Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you to John, Paul, and Tara for your presentations. I'm now going to transition us into the discussion and Q&A part. So while we're fielding questions from the audience, I want to pose a question to all three of you that's related to kind of navigating obstruction and legitimate safety concerns. So infrastructure capacity concerns like traffic, sewer, water, electric grid, fire safety concerns, they may be sometimes raised in bad faith as a pretext to block middle housing. So how can advocates and planners distinguish between legitimate safety and infrastructure concerns and political obstruction? Maybe let's start with John.
Yeah, so I think some of the lessons that Paul and Tara shared were really good on that point. Just, having the information around, what the community can expect in terms of timing and impact of some of these measures, particularly impact on infrastructure. I think, the point that was made was a lot of times the expectation is that by allowing middle housing, that simply the act of allowing it is going to sort of open the floodgates to an immediate spike in demand or an immediate, shift in burden on infrastructure systems. And, even in communities that have seen the greatest success with increase in middle housing, that's simply not, playing out. And Portland's probably the best case study to maybe draw from here. And if they're not experiencing it, I think that's a really good case study to hold up. I do want to address fire safety though, because that, especially when it comes to the building code side, that's probably the thing that comes up the most. When we were working through that here in Memphis, and we actually worked to get a bill passed at the state level in Tennessee around allowing passive fire protection in place of active fire protection for 3 and 4 unit buildings. And a lot of the pushback that we got was from from the fire safety side. I don't want to say that any of it is in bad faith. I mean, when it comes to building code regulations and fire code regulations, there's I think, solid rationale for, that backs why anyone would want to have elevated requirements for building safety. And so going into any conversation that I have, either with building officials or fire officials, I start there, recognizing that there are legitimate reasons why we have, many of these regulations in place. The problem is proportionality. The problem is the gap between 2 and 3 units. The problem is we go from small building standards to big building standards, but we're still dealing with small buildings. And there's a disproportionate cost impact that gets put on small multifamily, that those structures simply can't pencil out in so many different contexts. And what needs to be established is more of a middle ground that is addressing proportionality. The other thing to point out, too, particularly around fire safety, is that there has been study after study, from the National Fire Protection Association, that shows that our multifamily buildings that are built today are the safest buildings that have ever been built, safest residential buildings that have ever been built, and are far safer, I think 6 to 7 times safer than single family buildings that are built today. And a lot of that is because of that big leap in code requirements. And so certainly we want to make sure that we're building buildings to be as safe as they can be, but we have to sort of balance that with the cost impact of those requirements, because ultimately, if the cost impacts of building new are preventing someone from building what could be an even safer version of a multifamily building that maybe exists, that may have been built, 60, 80 years ago, then that means that we have population that's living in buildings that are not as safe as they could be, even with some requirements that are stepped down from what the model code says today. So again, it's really about proportionality and thinking about, to Paul and Tara's point, flexible standards that still meet our goals. And so I mentioned, passive fire protection can, especially for smaller buildings, can be just as, if not more effective than active fire protection at less cost. And that's ultimately, so we've been able to have success with that here in Memphis and in Tennessee. And I think other communities are coming around to those measures across the U.S.
Yeah. Thanks, John, for that. I appreciate very much having you on the call. Our study was only limited to, sewer capacity, so it's great to hear about all the other areas that your study covered. I'll just add 2 very quick high-level points, which is, I think, like John was suggesting, key to pushing back against potentially bad faith arguments, and not all the arguments out there are bad faith. It's just to follow the facts, right? And I think having planners and having specialists, whether it's engineers or somebody else, fire safety expert, having them collaborate and then communicate out to the public to set expectations, make sure that people understand. That's a great place to start. And then the only other thing that I would say is it's also, I think, the work of housing planners to sell the change as much as we possibly can. There's good reason to add housing. It can really help. Middle housing is a great solution. Making sure that we're telling that story often and clearly, I think, is also an important ingredient here to make sure that people are ready to support the change.
Thank you both. Definitely what you said about proportionality and following the facts is really critical. Celeste, I'm going to hand it to you to pose another question to our presenters.
Okay, we have a question from the chat or from the Q&A. Someone's asking about SB 79 upzoning projects, and for those outside of California, it's a new bill that allows larger projects near transit, and not just directly near transit, but a little further out. So he's asking if the conclusions about small impacts to infrastructure capacity. That hold true for middle housing would be the same for SB 79, slightly larger multifamily projects. And I think that would depend on the size. So does anyone else have other answers or thoughts about the development near transit?
I can make a small comment there. Uh, as it pertains to sewers specifically. Our study focused on middle housing. And I think the engineers that we were talking to were clear that as a building gets bigger, as lot coverage gets bigger, as permeable area decreases, the impacts, particularly related to stormwater, that does increase. And so I don't want to suggest that our findings about middle housing pertain in the same way in the scenario of an SB 79 project, that might be significantly larger in terms of massing. So I don't want to venture too far there. What I will say is, like, looking at the bigger picture, SB 79 projects do provide a way to take advantage of existing infrastructure capacity insofar as they are close to transit, right? So that's another piece of the puzzle, right? You're trying to take advantage of one set of infrastructure, but you may have to do additional planning to make sure that it works, for example, from the sewer side.
Okay. And another question from the Q&A. Do you know of jurisdictions, in addition to the ones that have already just made the change to require only IRC for small unit counts, of jurisdictions that have implemented proportionality to find that sort of middle ground between? Is there a middle ground in code currently for middle housing?
So I'll just talk a little bit about. So I answered a question in the chat about jurisdictions that have included 3 or more units in the residential code, and that certainly seems to be a path that a lot of cities and states are looking at, if not venturing down. In Memphis, back in 2021, we had made the move to go up to 6 units in our residential code. We had some issues with our state fire marshal, which is why we ended up going the legislative route that I talked about. So we ended up having to move that back to the commercial code. But since then, we've been able to work with our state fire marshal to create an appendix to our building code that covers up to 24 units with more flexible and proportionate standards for middle scale housing. That's specific to Memphis, but it's essentially sanctioned by the state fire marshal in Tennessee. So other communities in Tennessee could use that, and I'm actually working now to try to convert that into an ICC style appendix that potentially could be brought to the code review committees as a potential appendix into the IBC to allow other communities to do it. But other cities and states have kind of gone down this road. Dallas is probably the community that's made the biggest leap. They've included up to 8 units in their residential code. I talk about that a little bit in the Beyond Zoning report. New Hampshire and North Carolina have directed their administrations to change the state building code to allow up to 4 units in the residential code. I believe North Carolina has done that. I don't think New Hampshire has yet, that they've kind of gone through with the adoption of the change. And then Ohio has up to 3 units in their residential code. Kentucky allows any residential building, I believe, up to 20 units, as long as it's no more than 2 stories, to be exempt from sprinkler standards. So there's all these kind of just different nuanced requirements that you find as you go state to state, city to city. I'd say the momentum is picking up a lot more, but it's a relatively recent phenomenon that is, more or less from the recognition that a lot of us are coming to within the last year or so, that we can make these changes in zoning, but we got to go a little bit deeper if we want to see middle scale housing done at scale across our cities and states.
And in California, we recently passed a building code freeze. So there won't be changes to the building code until the next triennial cycle, which is concerning because of these barriers. So, but it sounds as though there may be things that could be done locally, even without state building code changes, that could help the situation. Would that be fair to say?
So it depends. Every state does it differently. In some states, the state controls it. In other states, Colorado, for example, essentially delegates building code authority to the local governments. Some states like Tennessee, they have a state code, but they allow jurisdictions throughout the state to adopt their own codes and their own amendments. Those amendments can't be less stringent than the state code, but depending on what state you're in, there's some flexibility. In Tennessee, for example, there's a little bit of flexibility with under the current administration, I'll say.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay, and then I guess let's just touch one more question from the Q&A before we shift to some other questions, Adri. This one asks, I mean, how big of a problem are these barriers? And this person asks, is it 5% of the problem for infrastructure denials, base denials, or more or less? Thoughts on what's the scope of this challenge?
John, do you want to start?
It's really variable based on market. One of the slides that I kind of talked through, but we skipped over during the technical difficulties is that gap between 2 to 3 units. Like I said, can a lot of times be a cost increase per square foot of 30%. If there's not sufficient demand in your market to be able to absorb that cost increase, then the gap is going to be the denial gap is going to be well over the 5%. I mean, it may be missing in your community for that reason.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I guess I can add a little bit to this too, is it's sort of it's hard to say like what percent of the problem it is. In some ways, it can be sort of like a light switch, at least locally, where if the costs are stacked to such a point where projects generally are seeming infeasible, then development activity will not occur. And so it in some ways um, there's a switch from activity is on versus activity is off based on how costly the requirements are. One example I can give of that from the sewer side is that in Charlottesville, which was one of the case studies that we looked into, they have what's called a disturbance area threshold, which is the amount of earth that's being disturbed. And certain stormwater requirements kick in if you're disturbing more than 6,000 square feet of area. Those stormwater requirements were very stringent. The city of Charlottesville had not seen any activity of middle housing construction despite allowing it. And they thought that disturbance area threshold and the stormwater requirements that came with it could have been one part of the story. Another part of the story was that they were facing a similar lawsuit to Arlington. So there was legal uncertainty too, and developers could get caught up in all sorts of a big legal fight, essentially. But this all to say that, requirements that may seem rational, benign, need to be looked at very carefully from a development feasibility standpoint because they can sort of switch off development activity if they go too far and it's just too risky or too costly a proposition for developers to take on.
Thanks. And kind of like expanding upon that, Paul and Tara, are there specific state level building or plumbing code changes that would meaningfully reduce the sewer implementation barriers cities face? Any policy recs?
Yeah, I can hop in on this one. We don't have a specific wish list of building or plumbing code standards that we're asking for. We want to leave that to the engineers. Tara and I are both planners. And so we'll leave that to those folks. But I think from a policy perspective, there is one thing that we can say, which is that we do endorse the idea of the state leading to help set standards. And it does not always make sense for each jurisdiction to figure this stuff out on their own. I think to some of the points that John was making in some of the discussion earlier, it can make sense for jurisdictions to go, to have some latitude. But the idea that everybody has to figure this out for themselves, that just doesn't seem like the most efficient approach. So what we heard from some of the public sector staff in Portland was that, they had tried to involve and successfully did involve state building code officials in figuring out how to navigate some of the changes that the city of Portland made. But that they had also sort of asked the state to lead a bit more on this issue because lots of other jurisdictions were going to be allowing middle housing in short order. And so a recommendation for us is that, for jurisdictions out there that are under a mandate to allow middle housing or that are considering allowing middle housing, advocating for a statewide approach that seems like it's going to be feasible and allows flexibility for jurisdictions. That seems like a really positive state level approach.
Awesome. So we have about 5 minutes left. I think we can get through one more question. So this is for both Paul, Tara, and John. What's the next research gap you'd want to tackle? Your research looks at building code, infrastructure management. What would be the next gap that you would want to take on?
Well, I could try on this one. So Portland right now is considering a more significant upzone, like I alluded to its inner east side, and has done a study of its existing infrastructure capacity to allow for bigger apartment buildings. So this might be more on the scale of the projects that might be allowed under SB 79, though I'm not super familiar with the legislation, so I don't know the exact figures there. But certainly, Portland is trying to facilitate more mid-rise apartment buildings, not just middle housing in more parts of town. What that will look like exactly, we don't know, but that's the goal. There are other jurisdictions that will be doing the same, that are doing the same, and it would be interesting to see um, whether there was a consistent approach, like a recipe a blueprint that jurisdictions could follow for doing the advocacy and the study related to infrastructure needs and planning for more mid-rise apartment buildings. I know Nashville is doing a housing and infrastructure study right now and big push there. So it would be interesting to look at several cities as case studies again to see how they approached this sort of problem and make some recommendations about how, cities of all sizes approach tackling these infrastructure questions for larger forms of housing, so that people didn't feel like they were inventing a process from the start, but were instead relying on best practices. That's one idea that comes to mind.
Yeah, to build on that, I think it would be interesting to learn what are the best practices for more planning departments and engineering, public works collaboration, because we saw sort of different variations of that in our case studies, but it would be interesting if there are ones that stick out as particularly successful.
Yeah, I sort of mentioned what I was working on already. Trying to create essentially an appendix for an ICC style appendix. There was a question in the Q&A about some of concerns from a structural standpoint, in addition to fire safety, and I think those are valid too. And one of the points that I made in the response is that a lot of communities that are, moving more units into the IRC, it's not just simply sort of deleting the number 2 and replacing it with 4 or 8. There's some additional standards that they're putting in place that are a little bit more stringent than straight IRC, but maybe not as stringent as IBC. So a recognition that, you know, there's something in the middle there that is needed. And so it's kind of the purpose of wanting to do that research around, you know, an appendix that might be calibrated for the ICC, in addition to the fact that there are factors that are going to have regional significance. You know, in Tennessee, we're not as concerned about snow loads as, you know, maybe Washington or New Hampshire. But, you know, so a lot of these requirements have to be calibrated to the region as well.
Excellent. And like you said, everything has to be tailored to local context. That's something really important that Casita Coalition tries to amplify. Well, we are at time, so I want to give a huge thank you to John, Paul, and Tara for joining us today as speakers and sharing their critical research and insights. Thank you to all our attendees. Apologies if we didn't get to your questions, but we really appreciate your engagement. The webinar recording will be posted on Casita Coalition's YouTube channel, and the slide presentations, along with the speakers' reports, will be available on the webinar event page on our website. So a huge thank you to our major funders, Arnold Ventures, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, JP Morgan Chase, Sobrato Philanthropies, San Francisco Foundation, Zillow, and Wells Fargo. A special shout out to our webinar sponsor, Arnold Ventures, and to our premier members for their support of Casita Coalition, which helps us put on these free webinars for all. We invite other ADU and middle housing professionals, community-based organizations, homeowners, and housing advocates to be part of the conversation and to stay involved in our work by becoming a member of Casita Coalition at casitacoalition.org. And in addition, please check out our Casita Academy learning platform, where we offer Friday afternoon workshops as well as an in-depth 3-week ADU course. Our website has a number of resources, including our past webinars and guidebooks about middle housing and ADUs for professionals and for homeowners. So again, you can find these resources on casitacoalition.org. Thank you, everyone, again, and we'll see you at our next webinar.